Yeah, so we're looking at homelessness. What I mean by homelessness is rough sleeping. So homelessness is a generic term which can mean lots of things. Sofa surfing, living in overcrowded houses, living in a hotel, a B&B. I'm not looking at that. I'm looking at the apex of this problem, which is people, our fellow citizens, living and dying in entries, surrounded by rats and lying in excrement. That's what I'm talking about. And that's what I'm going to fix. I've been involved in rough sleeping for nearly 2 decades. When I worked at Manchester Council, I was the chair of a multi-agency panel, including the police, NHS, drug services, councils, looking at ending rough sleeping in Greater Manchester, in the city of Manchester. And at that point, we had 17 rough sleepers. Can you imagine that? 17 rough sleepers in Manchester. We now have 100, if not 200. I think, yeah, it's more like 200. And then when I left, I set a charity up, and then one of the projects I set up was working on the streets in the city centre with rough sleepers, getting them off the streets into accommodation, and then getting them into employment. And we helped hundreds of people. We can end rough sleeping in Greater Manchester in 1 year. That's all it takes. It'll take a little bit of money, but not much money, only a tiny, tiny, tiny bit. Andy Burnham has spent hundreds of millions on this, and the problem is slightly better today than it was 6.5 years ago. And he spent hundreds of millions. He promised to end rough sleeping in 3 years. He's now had 6.5, and it's actually increasing. The latest stats that he's released is actually increasing again in Greater Manchester. I'm going to end it in a year, and that sounds almost impossible and crazy. The reason why Andy Burnham has failed to achieve what he wanted to achieve was he only addressed one part of the problem of rough sleeping, and that was the accommodation side. He is getting people off the streets, but every time he takes someone off the street, someone replaces that person. So it's a never-ending conveyor belt. What I will do on day one is we will clamp down on begging. There'll be no begging in Greater Manchester. Not in the city centres, not in the town centres, not outside supermarkets, outside petrol stations, outside any shops. For the first few months, you'll be moved on. You'll be warned, you'll be moved on. After the first couple of months, you'll be arrested. It's illegal to beg in this country. We won't be prosecuting people necessarily. We won't be sending people to jail or to the courts. There's no point. But we'll disrupt begging. We'll get to a stage where there's no point begging in Greater Manchester because you make no money. Because the second you sit down, you get hassled by the police. It'll be one of the police's privacy because the mayor is also the police crime commissioner. For people who say, well, that's extremely unfair, that sounds quite nasty, picking on beggars, there's not more criminals you could deal with. The answer to that is every penny that's earned through begging is spent with drug dealers. So you're actually funding organised crime. All the drugs rough sleepers take damages them even more and eventually kills them. Most of the people on the streets begging are not even rough sleeping. They have accommodation. They're just begging for money for drugs. They're tomorrow's rough sleepers. Because if they keep taking the amount of drugs they're taking, they will lose their accommodation. They will end up on the streets. So we're just supplying more rough sleepers for tomorrow. So once we end begging, the people sat on the streets then will be genuinely homeless and rough sleeping. They'll have less drugs in their system, which means they're easier to work with, which means they're more likely to take help and support we'll offer them. I'm going to create a series of hostels across Greater Manchester, only about 6, that's how many we're going to need. Disused warehouses, we're going to fill them with garden sheds, and each shed will be an individual living pod. So with a door, storage area, TV, and then we can move people off the streets into them on day one. It doesn't matter what their issue is. So at the moment, we'll go out and we'll speak to people, do you want accommodation? And if they say, yeah, it's like, oh, you've got a dog. There's only a couple of hostels in Greater Manchester that will take dogs, so we can't help you today. Or you're a drug user, you know that you can't take drugs in this hostel. Well, I'm going to take drugs tonight. Well, that hostel won't let you in. These are the barriers that are stopping people getting off the streets and into accommodation. And as mayor, I'll be saying all my hostels will take dogs, we'll have kennels. All my hostels won't throw you out if you're taking drugs or you're drinking alcohol. If we see you with drugs, you'll be arrested because it's still illegal. So, I'm not looking at semi-legalizing drugs, I'm not. But if you quietly take drugs or you come back to the hostel and you've taken drugs and you're not violent, all fine. And the reason why we don't do that now is in case someone dies. If someone ODs in a hostel, the councils are scared stiff they'll get to blame. Why are you letting people take drugs? They're dying in your hostels. So they would rather have these individuals die on the streets because you can't blame the council then. What I'll do as mayor is say, I take full responsibility. I take personal responsibility. It's not the hostel's fault. It's not the council's fault. I take responsibility if people OD in our hostels, because the odds are that person would have OD'd on the streets anyway and died. At least they died in a bed here, not surrounded by rats. So I will take that. And on the plus side, that's one death. Look at the dozens of people we've got off the streets and into proper accommodation and improved their lives. That's the flip side to this. Again, I'm tired of people being cowards. I'm sick of senior managers only worried about their job and their pension and doing the wrong things because the wrong things are convenient for them. Not in this for me. So that's how we deal with that. Then we need to look at people who come to Manchester, because people come from all over the country to be rough sleep in Greater Manchester. So we can't then be a beacon for every rough sleeper.
Why is that? Why is it a hotspot? Why is it a destination for that?
It's got a great reputation of this is where you come to be a rough sleeper, because there's that much free food being given out, that much tents and sleeping bags all being given out every day. There's lots of services, so you're more likely to get accommodation as a rough sleeper in Manchester than you are in almost anywhere in the country. So if you're a rough sleeper who happens to want accommodation, make your way to Manchester. You're more likely to get accommodation. So there's a pull factor here, pulling people into Greater Manchester. And that's unfair on the taxpayers of Greater Manchester. We shouldn't be paying the bills for other councils across the country who don't do their job and send these people to Manchester, Greater Manchester. So what I'll be doing, I'll be looking at taking individual councils to court. We'll be invoicing them. So Greater Manchester will say, we dealt with Joe Bloggs, who comes from Coventry, lived in Coventry all his life. And he's now turned up at Manchester and we've dealt with him here. So we'll send an invoice to Coventry Council for 80, 90 grand, because that's what it'll cost. And then they won't pay it and we'll take him to court. And we'll start embarrassing councils and we'll embarrass the government and say, this is what needs to be done. The reason why we have a problem across the country is because councils won't do their jobs. And as national government, you need to set up a system where you start rating councils on how quickly they get rough sleepers off the streets. And then you need to start fining councils who are failing. That's how we get councils to do better. And that hopefully will stop the flow of people into Greater Manchester. Otherwise, it's a never-ending story. And again, Manchester Council, if we've got people who are foreigners who turn up in the country and end up rough sleeping in Greater Manchester, we need to take the Home Office to court, because I want the money of the Home Office. You allowed this person in the country. You gave him leave to remain. This is a Home Office problem. We want 80 grand off you because we just helped Ali Hussein into accommodation and got him off the streets. This is a bill for you for the Home Office. Greater Manchester will not be taken advantage of if I'm mayor. And if I'm successful in some of these cases, other towns, other cities will go, right, we can start charging failing councils for sending us their broken people. That's one of the ways we change this across the country as well. What I do in Greater Manchester isn't just for Greater Manchester, it's to improve the whole country. I want to show a new path of how we can improve many of our social problems. Because if it works here, it'll work everywhere.